Well, we continue with the lovely book of The Tale of the Mirror, because Rudolf Gachet is such an inspiration. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. We are now at little past 12 here, and the lovely sun has started to change into cloudiness, little by little. And we were talking about philosophical reflection and how philosophical reflection is trying to diminish the contradictions of isolated reflection, and by doing so it becomes formal. It lends itself to formalism, and this formalism is what philosophy is trying to fuse contradiction, and by then doing nullification, the word I didn't really like, nullification, or as in German said, Vernichtung. Förintande kanske är bättre än förstörande. Sounds tough, but it is really clear what it's pointing to. See if I can manage to drink coffee here with my protection thing. And this is, in most, one could say, this is reason we are talking about now. Philosophical reflection is mostly what we say by reason, and that is an acknowledgement of the oppositions in a formal way. And we have a problem there. Indeed, what causes the downfall in page 39, the downfall of philosophical reflection, the indeterminate that it must necessarily oppose to determinate, being in order to determine it fully, the infinite that it cannot avoid juxtaposing to the finite. That is an opposition that throws philosophical reflection into the endless process of determination. And that is something rational, belonging to the order of reason itself, in quotation, as posited by the intellect, because taken by itself it merely expresses the negating of the finite. So merely negating the finite can never be the infinite. And I think it's a great deal of truth to that saying. Although the infinite task of determination that ruins philosophical reflection is a characteristic of the lower standpoint from which the absolute synthesis is considered, it is a characteristic of reason as well. This infinite task shows understanding to be manipulated by reason, because it is reason that makes the intellect boundless. And in this infinite wealth, the intellect and its objective world meet their downfall. It is becoming too clearly defined, and this is what Gachet means by formal. By juxtaposing the opposition, we gain definition at one level, but at another level we are losing it. And that's problematic because all levels needs to be considered to have a higher degree. So one can compare the lower degree, there is only one level considered, whether it's high up or down low, it does not really matter. But whereas you have a higher understanding, you have an understanding on the lower, the middle and the higher and so forth. Let us recall that opposites of philosophical reflection are only opposites of thought. That is very important. Their merely ideal nature is a function of the indeterminate, conceptualized by philosophical reflection under the form of the ego, which is turned into the correlate of the totality of the determinations of being. Yet, because the ego is thus placed in absolute opposition to the object, and you could also say here we have a juxtaposition between the ego and its world. And this is turned into the correlate of the totality of the determinations of being. Yet, because the ego is thus placed in absolute opposition to the object. So by placing an opposition rather than a juxtaposition, you get, well, in some reason you can call this a mirror effect on this level. Something that we usually call cognition. Why is that? Yeah, in everyday language and what used to be the science of cognition, we usually said that there is a subject perceiving the outer world and that there is an absolute opposition between the world and the perceiver. I mentioned that before, the perceiver being of a nature completely different than what is perceived. And that is, of course, the opposition between consciousness and matter, which leads to all these rather hard contradictions. And hardened contradictions is usually a showcase for being in the lower grade. It's a correct understanding, yes, without a doubt, but it doesn't cover all levels. It's just on one level. I think so far it's the best I can explain. Because it is indebted to understanding, philosophical reflection is unable to think an organic relation between the opposite it sets forth. Very good. As ideal opposites whose objective pole, moreover, is determined by a host of additional ideal opposites, they remained in absolute contradiction to one another. Thus, the totality of philosophical reflection is composed only of the ego, i.e., indeterminateness or self-determination, and the object determinatedness, well, the adjective of being determined. And this is beyond whose play of reciprocity it cannot reach. And this is a clear reference to Fichte's transcendental philosophy. And Hegel shows the purely formal and antithetical synthesis of understanding to be rooted in a hypostasis of the ego. Well, the ego here comes into existence, so to speak, by hypostasis. So we get the ego by dividing something, and the thing that is reflecting becomes the ego, and the thing that is looking into the thing that's looking into the reflection is the ego, and what it reflects is the world. I think that's the gestalt that makes sense. So you see how the mirror can give light to this rather difficult relation, so to speak. You look into the mirror and you see something, and all of a sudden both ego and the world spring into existence. They both get hypothesized at the same moment. It does not take a millisecond. It is a thing that happens completely instantaneously. Instantaneous. It's a handful, this. And according to Hegel himself, Schelling opposes an objective subject object relation, an objective identity, to Fichte's subjective one in order to overcome the subjective and merely ideal determination of the opposites, and to overcome with the same stroke understanding and philosophical reflection. How to overcome, I would say, this sharp division between the reflection and what is reflected. One could say that the ego and the world comes to being, and how to understand that from another level. So we made it true at one level, and now we want to do it at another level. And of course that will be done in the next paragraph. With such an objective interpretation of absolute identity, the totality of moments at play in philosophical reflection begins to come into view. The hitherto ideal opposites, whose signification now derives from the totality of which they are parts, appear as real opposites in Schelling's philosophy of nature, as the theory of nature's self-construction. Self-construction is the very moment when you look into the mirror, you get a reflection, and you also get this hypothesized something looking into the reflection. This, I couldn't call it splitting anymore, because this is actually widening the understanding for this most interesting deepening of what this is about. As soon as philosophical reflection turns into the conceptualization of the absolute identity of subject and object, it becomes, in Hegel's terms, speculative. But it truly becomes speculation only when it conceives of the absolute identity as subjective and objective subject-object, because only this determination of absolute synthesis takes the totality of its logically possible determination into account. Needless to say, this concept of the absolute coincides with Hegel's philosophical enterprise. I dare to say this is maybe the most complicated ideas you can figure about, and one of the reasons it's not abstractly complicated, it's complicated on a mere practical level, because it goes all the way down into the really practical, up to a level with higher abstraction, and it does it at the very same time. And it's not something I've seen before, and I say this is probably the most important tool so far when it comes to the Derridian exposure of philosophy and how to understand it. Well, I mentioned before, in the taking place of the self-destruction of reflection, being the faculty of being a limitation, reflection nullifies itself and all being and everything limited, as soon as it connects itself with the absolute. The self-destruction of reflection resulting from the reflection upon reflection takes place at the moment at which the limited is related to the absolute. So there is a relation between philosophical reflection and absolute reflection. The next thing we'll come into in the next lecture, because this is breaking my brain. But I think it could be a good idea to analyze this process of self-destruction in more detail by conceiving of the totality of all determinations as an antinomic unity in which the opposites are destroyed precisely to the extent that they are in relation to antinomy. Reflection reveals itself as reason by pointing toward an absolute synthesis. Indeed, in the antinomic destruction of opposites, a destruction that leads to the establishment of a formal totality, philosophical reflection has not maintained but nullified the opposition, understanding of the two terms or of either of them, and it has not maintained but nullified the claim that is itself the absolute and the eternal. It has thrown itself into the abyss of its perfection. And this is the area of perfection. This is the same when you juxtapose it, two things to make it sharper. Maybe this one. And to make this one sharper, you juxtapose it to something else. Could be a background, foreground, could be side by side, could also be at depth. And this gives you sharpness, but it also, in this sharpness, you lose the opposition, you nullify them, it disappears. So first you have a splitting, the mirror splits, you hypothesize the ego. The ego is the one that makes for sharpness when he wants to devolve into philosophical speculation, and it wants to have definites, and it absolves take in both oppositions, because that's the only way to have determinate. But in getting the sharpness, the contradiction is lost. Nota bene, that this doesn't mean that everything is gone. The destruction is not complete. You still gain a greater understanding. But what is destruction on one level is gain at another level. And we will show later how you progress in more levels. It's the number of levels that are important, not the correct or the level at each degree. So the degree at each level. I think I rest my brain for a while here before I get into the absolute. I think I just start with absolute reflection. In order to understand the nature of absolute reflection and how it compares to other forms of reflection, we must first understand in the manner in which transition from philosophical reflection, it starts in philosophical reflection when you start to speculate, and by furthering this speculation, that will lead you into the absolute reflection. It needs speculation, and time-wise this takes time. The Greek probably needed 3-4 centuries to evolve from the merely philosophical reflection, sorry to say merely, it's nothing merely with it, and go over to the absolute reflection. But I put in a dog's ear here, and we continue. We are presently at page 39. Let's see what this is going to lead us. I think I need also to